All right, hello and welcome everybody to the latest episode of the Big Three on CPA TV. As always, my name is Mihir Torsekar, and I'm joined by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg. And together we're here to talk to you all about the Big Three events happening in trade this week. But before we get into that, we wanted to talk to you about a special highlight that we have for this week, and that's our special guest, Jeff Ferry, who's going to come talk to us and help us in our conversation. So the first thing we're going to have Jeff talk about is his latest article, his Substack article on everything economists have said is basically wrong. So he walks us through everything, especially with regard to tariffs, was wrong. So he's talking specifically about the predictions about the effects of tariffs on inflation, which have proven false, the effect on growth, economic growth, which was proven incorrect, and a whole host of other metrics that we're going to be talking to him about. The second issue is that we wanted to talk about the latest moves by China in the ongoing trade war between the United States. This latest move concerns the restrictions that they've applied to rare earth minerals, as well as some other items, synthetic diamonds and things like that. So we're going to talk about the implications of that. And the third issue on the agenda is that copper was recently added to the critical minerals list, and we're going to talk about why we believe that CPA, that's a really good thing. Number one, it'll unlock federal support and funding, enable strategic stockpiling and trade protection, and encourage private investment. So without further ado, let's get on to our episode. All right, so first item on the agenda, I want to talk to Jeff. First of all, let's bring on Jeff and just talk a little bit about, you've been at CPA for a long time. You've been obviously a tremendous contributor to the mission and really driven the econ team forward, gotten us to this position, and have really been speaking about the your perspective on tariffs, and you've been, frankly, because you're too humble to say this, you've been right most of the time, frankly, but just not all the time, right? So let's talk to you about your latest article, your latest Substack article. Everything Economist told you about tariffs was bunk. And Jeff, why don't you talk us through some of the main points and some of your key findings there?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Mihir. I'm happy to do so. So, what I said in this article, which I published several days ago to my Substack, and my Substack is called The Growth Imperative, and the article was called Everything Economists Told You About Tariffs Was Wrong. And I identified 5 things that if you read the media, you've heard from economists, and they've all so far proved to be wrong. One is that tariffs would lead directly to price inflation. Second thing was that tariffs would make the dollar rise. And the third thing was that tariffs would encourage retaliation from foreign partners. Fourth was that our allies would move closer to China as a result of Trump's tariffs. And finally, that tariffs would reduce global economic growth for the year. And so in each of these cases, the mainstream economists have proven to be wrong. And in the article, I provide the data and some of the evidence to back it up. But just quickly, I guess, to go through those things, tariffs have had minimal effect on consumer prices so far. It's been about 6 months since Trump announced the first tariffs. And yet what we're seeing, consumer prices are a little on the CPI index is a little on the high side, but that's mainly due to things like food and shelter, which have nothing to do with imports and nothing to do with tariffs. Tariffs and prices, it's been surprising actually that things like new cars and apparel have had lower price inflation, in some cases, in case of women's apparel, negative, despite the double whammy of high tariffs on China, where a lot of clothing Americans buy is manufactured, and secondly, eliminating de minimis. A lot of clothing used to come in under the de minimis loophole. You would think that would raise prices, but in fact, that hasn't happened. Second thing, the dollar's gone down instead of up. Thirdly, important allies like the European Union have shied away from retaliation because President Trump's unique negotiating style is if I punch you and you punch me back, I'll punch you back even harder. And that doesn't work easily in economists' models. So there hasn't been that much retaliation outside of China. Fourth point I made was that allies would move closer to China. In fact, what we're seeing, particularly in Europe right now, is other European countries enacting tariffs and restrictions on goods coming from China. So they're actually sort of imitating our policy while they continue to insult President Trump in all their speeches, because that wins votes in Europe. They are actually imitating him in some interesting ways. And finally, on economic growth, the OECD revised up its prediction about a month ago, its forecast for this year and next, because it saw tariffs are not having very much of an effect on global economic growth. I mean, the U.S. Growth is not too bad this year. China is having its own internal problems, and the U.S. tariffs are making things worse for the Chinese economy. But on the other hand, they've increased exports elsewhere. So, China's at whatever its, sort of 5% sort of target, continues to be at that target, come what may. So that, in a nutshell, is what's in my article. Anything you want to pick up on that, Mihir?
Yeah, let me turn it over to Andrew real quick, because I want to hear your thoughts. We've been obviously talking about much the same topics on our podcast. So go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that a core element behind a lot of the things you're talking about in this article, Jeff, is this big assumption that economists don't take into account, is that when you do have tariffs, you have a increase in production. And that's really the whole goal of tariffs. And you've talked about this a lot in a lot of the economic models that economists use that don't take this into account. But I think that's exactly what we're seeing, and why we're not seeing some of those increases in price and not some of that retaliation, because these tariffs are directly encouraging increases in U.S. investment and production. And we got big news this week from both JP Morgan investing in U.S. supply due to supply vulnerabilities with China, as well as Stellantis announcing large investments in U.S. automaking, that we're seeing these tariffs have a real effect. And companies and different countries like the EU, as you mentioned, are recognizing China as a big problem and realizing that in order to actually work in this new tariff system, they should be investing in the United States. And that's directly what these tariffs are supposed to be encouraging. And it's great to see it actually starting to work.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead, Mihir.
Well, now, one thing I was just going to say, I know that we've talked a lot about some of the erroneous assumptions that are made in these models. And I remember I'm stricken by, back in January, I read a study in the Financial Times they reviewed. There was like this big, shocking headline talking about, under this scenario of a model, out of the economics consulting group in Europe or something like that, was talking about the, trillions of dollars that would be lost as a result of Trump's trade war. And their core assumption was retaliation by other countries, which, of course, as you mentioned in your piece, has not materialized it really at all. I mean, there's been a lot of saber rattling, but by and large, there's actually been more of a move towards following what the U.S. model has been, particularly, with steel. And even, I think Mexico erected some tariffs specifically against China in response to U.S. pressure. So again, I think a lot of what undergirds a lot of these assumptions or these models is really some faulty assumptions. But go ahead, I cut you off.
Yeah, I agree. I think the faulty assumptions stem from economists' need to simplify everything. I mean, I often tell people that because a piece of paper is flat or graph is flat, you've got to have only one independent variable and one dependent variable. In other words, quantity is totally dependent on price. And so, to take a specific example, what economists would like to do is say, okay, the average effective tariff on automobiles is, and then they calculate some number, and it's pretty complicated because there's different tariffs on different countries, and Canada and Mexico have certain exclusions, right? But let's say you came up with 15% as the average tariff on automobiles, and then they try to build an equation which tells them prices of automobiles will go up by X. I mean, the Yale Budget Lab said between 61 and 80% of the tariff value gets translated into consumer prices. So in other words, they think car prices are going to go up by 10%. And then their little model tells them if that happens, car consumption, automobile consumption goes down by a certain percentage. So, all that is how you publish papers in academic economics. But let's look instead at what happens in the real world. In the real world, the Trump administration very cleverly pulls all these auto executives into private meetings in Washington and says, look, we're thinking of doing this. And I think particularly the sticking point was we're thinking of putting heavy tariffs on all the things you make in Canada and Mexico and bring into the United States. And then you have companies like Stellantis that say, oh, that would be incredibly disruptive, Mr. Trump. Instead, we're going to build some factories in the U.S. and we're going to hold prices where they are, because that's another thing the administration says is we don't want to see skyrocketing auto prices. On top of that, you have that Stellantis had a new CEO in January of this year. And if you know anything about the corporate sector, which I know you guys do, and people in politics do, but academic economists tend to know very little about how the corporate sector actually works. So this new guy, Antonio Filosa, when you're a new CEO, it makes it very convenient to say the previous regime made all sorts of mistakes. We're going to fix those mistakes. We're a new broom. We've got some great ideas. And among his good ideas, well, we'll see, but among his new ideas are Jeep Cherokee and the Hemi engine. And basically, we're going to emphasize gasoline engines because the Trump administration has changed the laws on how many gasoline engines you're allowed to produce. So they're rushing out these new models. And the last thing they want to do is hike prices when they're bringing out a new model. They want to make these new models popular. They want everybody to talk about how thrilled they are that the Jeep Cherokee has come back, because I don't know, I'm not a Jeep driver, but 20 years ago, people had Jeep Cherokees and they loved it, right? So all these contingent and unpredictable effects lead to what we're seeing, which is new car prices are flat. New car production in the U.S. is definitely going to go up because Stellantis announced, I think, 5 different locations where they're increasing production. On top of that, you've got Hyundai and you've got Mercedes saying they're going to do more in this country, and Toyota made the same comment. So in other words, it's impossible to cram all that into an economic model because every corporation's behavior is contingent on the others. And basically what we see in price, which I know is an important point to you guys, what we see on price is instead of hiking prices by some magical formula like 61 to 80%, they're all sitting across the table from each other saying, well, I'm going to hold prices and I'm not going to be the first to move. And if the other guys around this table don't move, then I won't move. So we've seen a lot of price stability, whereas what we see in things like eggs and beef, where it's a market that works for economic models because there's hundreds of producers of these things, is prices are more determined by costs, and so those prices have gone up.
And I think another important element. Another important element here is that we don't just import everything such as automobiles. We still have a very healthy automotive manufacturing industry here in the U.S. that keeps prices competitive. We've lost a lot of ground to imports in the last few decades, but we have a lot of capacity here in the U.S. and those imports must compete with them. They can't just raise prices without thinking about domestic manufacturers that are still in the field. And this is both U.S. companies and foreign companies. There's BMW manufacturing in South Carolina. There's Honda manufacturing in Ohio, and that helps keep prices down as well. We've lost a lot of ground, but we still do have a healthy manufacturing sector in a lot of these industries.
Right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, no, just to wrap up, that was a really fun piece, and I think it really kind of encapsulates some of the main arguments that we've been voicing at CPA for quite some time now, of course, just talking about just why these economists are so wrong. And I think there is a lot of noise in the system, and for folks to continue to rely on outdated models with kind of curious assumptions, it ends up giving you results that are sort of disconsonant with what's happening in the real world. So we'll continue to watch the data and follow that story here. wanted to move on to the second topic of the day, which is talking about the new export controls that China has issued on rare earths, lithium-ion batteries, and synthetic diamonds. And I think it really kind of came as a shock to the U.S. and some other Western governments, especially, who rely on, obviously the rare earth minerals for defense applications in particular. But China has actually upped the ante a little bit by mimicking what we have, the FDPR restrictions that we apply to semiconductor rules, which imposes another layer of restrictions, I think, on companies who have even just trace amounts of any Chinese sourced rare earth minerals. You have to apply for some sort of a license to even be able to export to the United States, and that has the potential to kind of disrupt supply chains. I wanted to talk to obviously you, Jeff, and Andrew about what you guys see the implications are here. What are the moves that you think the United States has as far as leverage that we have? Because a lot of what I'm hearing is, oh, well, China is the dominant supplier of rare earths. Their ability to weaponize the supply chain leaves us in a bind, and we are just, we're going to lose this trade war because of it. So go ahead, let me know what you guys think. Jeff, I'll toss it to you first.
Okay, I would say that we are in a bit of a bind. I mean, China does dominate both the production of refined rare earths and the production of lithium-ion batteries, and we can't turn up the dial on these things overnight. So I understand why the Trump administration is getting involved in negotiations here, because we are just dependent on rare earths for so many things, the automobile industry, the defense industry, the semiconductor industry, all the machinery involved in all those industries, and the automobiles themselves use the magnets that are made from the rare earths, right? So, there are steps to raise our production capability in this country, and there are steps around the world in places like Australia to mine more rare earths where the rare earths are under the ground. But, this is a problem, and China does have a global near monopoly, and, that makes them a single point of failure, to use the industrial expression, or it gives them a lot of geostrategic power. So we've got to work really hard to develop alternative sources, number one. And number two, we've got to negotiate now and, find a way to get them to relax some of these restrictions, frankly. I mean, we can't do very much overnight, like I said. So negotiations required.
Yeah, and I think that it's also essential, as Jeff mentioned, that we need to have these long-term investments in U.S. rare earth supply with magnets. All these are critical industries that both our commercial sector and our military really depend on, and we simply can't be reliant on China in the long term for these materials. But also importantly, I think that we have an underutilized trump card in these negotiations, and that is access to U.S. capital markets. Chinese companies and Chinese development for the past few decades has really relied a lot on U.S. funds, particularly Wall Street, retirement accounts, all of these different U.S. financial tools to fund their development. This has been a big investment opportunity for the U.S. financial sector, but China has equally benefited from this, and they need this continued investment to keep a lot of these industrial capacities go. And so I think that this is one thing that the U.S. can increasingly utilize, that if we can cut China off, or at least use that trump card, we can have a little bit more of a flexibility in this negotiation with China. And I think that that is going to be an important tool moving forward as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Back in 2010, when China first previewed what their plan was to weaponize their supply, or their dominance of supply chains in rare earth elements, when they applied this, I think owing to a territorial dispute with Japan back in 2010, they cut off Japan with export controls, if I'm not mistaken. Japan actually responded by stockpiling minerals, and over time, their strategy has reduced their reliance on China for, these rare earth elements. They find themselves in a much better situation. It's unfortunate that we didn't have the foresight to do that. I think right now, these sort of moves by China is really, it's such a, it's such a dramatic move. And I think the United States and Western allies are recognizing that we can't rely on China anymore. And I do think they are trying to put in place efforts to try to diminish China's dominance in that field. They've got their work cut out for them, but there's something like 22 mines coming online over the next 5 to 7 years, I believe. I know that the Pentagon is moving to secure up to $1 billion worth of critical minerals as part of like a global stockpiling spree. So the chipping away at China's dominance is not going to happen overnight, but I have to believe that China's long-term strategy of consistently showing the world that we're not a reliable supplier anymore is going to force other countries to either work together, the United States alongside its other allies, to try to determine or to try to figure out alternative opportunities or options to try to source these materials, or frankly, even just adjust their supply chain so that they're using less critical minerals. I mean, we're already seeing examples in Europe, for example, where automobile production is trying to be tweaked in such a way that it relies less on rare earth magnets. So that's definitely going to be a story we're going to have to watch. I mean, obviously the U.S., I don't think we're just completely in a bind. I do think we have options. But you would like to see a little bit of cooling of the tensions between the United States and China moving forward. So again, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. The third item on our agenda today is that copper was recently added to the critical minerals list. The U.S. Geological Survey formally announced that. We at CPA are very supportive of that. We've done some research on copper, and I wanted to maybe first turn it to you guys to hear your thoughts on why you guys think this is a wise move, and then I'll wrap up with some of my thoughts.
I guess from my main I don't know that much about the copper market, but it's obvious that the price of copper keeps rising, and it's also obvious that the price of electric power paid by the U.S. consumer keeps rising. It is becoming more of a political issue, and that's partly because of copper, but it's also because of the AI boom and all the data centers that are being built around the U.S. that are consuming, between 5 and 10% of the total electricity production in the U.S., and this is going to naturally raise prices. And, as I say, it could become a political issue. We've got a governor's race in Virginia happening right now, and of course, neither candidate says anything halfway intelligent about what they'll do about electricity. But in any case, it's a factor. So anything we can do to increase copper production and increase the the speed at which we add capacity to our electric grid is a positive in this country, and making copper a critical mineral is a good step in the right direction on that score.
And I think this is part of a much broader. Yeah, I think this is part of a much broader approach that countries are really realizing that they need an entire supply chain approach to a lot of these issues. And it really goes all the way back to the base metals that everything is based on. And we're seeing that across a lot of critical sectors, and copper is just the latest one of this. And it's not just the U.S. that's realizing this. If you listen to President Macron of France recently talking about meeting sector by sector tariffs in Europe, this is, again, this broad recognition that we need to control the broader supply chain, and we need to correct for Chinese overcapacity. And same thing with Europe now correcting for steel. They've recently announced that they want to cut the steel quota by 50% and also raise the out of quota tariff rate to 50%, all in a broad range to significantly cut down on steel imports to Europe. They're realizing it maybe a few years later than we did in the US, but they're coming around to this realization that we need these tariffs to protect these broad industries and protect our entire supply chain, all the way back to stuff like copper and steel that are the critical inputs for all of our manufacturing industries.
Yeah, it almost kind of gets back to Jeff's argument about how, if anything, some of these countries are actually moving more in our direction and trying to recognize our approach and trying to adopt that as well, because they recognize, for all the hand-wringing about the U.S. policies and tariffs and export restrictions, whatever policies that we have on the books, China's overcapacity is a much greater disruptive force in global trade. And that's what we all need to be, joining hands and trying to understand, and how do we combat that? And so, it's interesting because, like, publicly there will be a lot of hand wringing and complaining about the U.S., but privately and in a less heated environment, you see the policies that are being implemented, and they're very much more in line with what we're trying to do. I mean, I think this is absolutely an important step in the right direction. You guys mentioned the AI data center boom here in Virginia, where Jeff and I live. I think I saw a statistic, something like we process something like 90% of the world's internet traffic flows through data centers in Virginia, which is just wild to me. But copper is going to be a critical ingredient in building up those data centers, and with all the investment that's coming online for AI and the requirement, I guess, the pursuit for us in the United States of being the leader of AI technologies going forward, this is just going to be so important for us to do that. So I see no downside to identifying copper as a critical mineral. It's going to unlock federal support and funding. I think going to encourage private investment, sending a good demand signal. So just a whole lot of winning across the board on that policy. So good on the administration for doing that. So I think that wraps up our show for the week, unless you guys had any concluding thoughts. I guess I'll give you guys real quick a chance to just see if you guys have any other additional thoughts on what we've talked about today before we wrap up.
I would just say, Mihir, that the way I see it, I mean, I'm older than you guys. I can remember the high point of globalization. I was in the networking industry, and John Chambers, who was the CEO of Cisco Systems and really the industry leader, I remember he was working hard to find business in China around 2000 to 2005, and he gave one speech where, and he's from West Virginia, and he had that country accent. Well, of course, he was a computer engineer. He's a very smart guy, but he had that down home accent, and he said something along the lines of, "I'm happy I'm an American, but if I was going to be any other nationality, I would want to be Chinese, because you folks are the leaders of the world in technology, blah, blah, blah." And Cisco and company I was in, we really believed that at that point. And, that globalization vision is what's led the world to being dependent on China for so many different goods, and their intentions are not necessarily good in dominating so many different industries. And not just the copper that goes into AI data centers, but I was in fiber optics, and we see a lot of those optical transceivers are now coming out of China, and Google is dependent on Chinese parts to build a data center in the United States. And so we have to the world, and I think many people get this now in both political parties and in industry, we have to move beyond globalization to say there's a certain amount of self-reliance that every major nation and every continent's got to have. And I'm encourage my European friends, they ought to be more self-reliant in Europe, and we need to be more self-reliant in the U.S. and in the Americas. And, Asia, countries like Japan, as you said before, have got to deal with Chinese domination too. So, the world is moving in a very interesting direction as compared to 20 years ago.
Great point.
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic points.
Andrew, did you have it? Yeah.
And I think that I don't have anything additional to add, but just wanted to thank Jeff for coming on today. And this is a really interesting conversation. And yeah, thanks for all your great work you do in this field. I think that this is definitely all the stuff that the people in Washington need to be hearing moving forward. And hopefully we'll see a lot of progress in the next year or two.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right.
My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you on again, Jeff. Appreciate you coming on. All right, well, thank you guys for watching this week. Till next time, we look forward to talking to you about the next big 3 items happening in trade. But until then, hope you all have a good week, and we'll see you soon. Take care.